Good afternoon, good morning, hello everybody. It's a pleasure to introduce this segment in the program for which I will be the moderator. I'm Guy Berger. I'm a former journalist, former editor, former publisher, and now I work at UNESCO as a director. You might be interested to hear that last month, actually earlier this month, last month, we're the 1st of December. Last month, the UNESCO's 193 member states agreed with acclamation to support what's called the Windhoek Plus 30 Declaration. This Windhoek Plus 30 Declaration builds on the original 1991 Windhoek Declaration that called for press freedom, pluralism, and independence. And the new one really draws attention to the ongoing significance of freedom, pluralism, and independence. But it adds some new points. And the first of the ones that it adds is the question of media viability. In other words, press freedom remains as an ongoing call, but it's also the case that press freedom can be an empty shell if there's a shrinking news media that is trying to use this freedom to produce information as a public good, but is under such enormous economic pressure. In today's mix of communications content of all kinds, we do need information as a public good. We need this if we are going to get to grips with climate change and the global sustainability crisis. And likewise, we need solutions so that journalism as a key contributor to information in the public interest. We need solutions so that journalism can be produced with sustainable revenues to cover the costs. In short, without press freedom, we don't have real journalism, but without journalism, there's no reality to press freedom. This is the clear, double-sided message of our times. Now, as everybody knows, there are many mechanisms and methods to secure news media viability. Some old, some new, some are market-based, some are dependent on extra market measures. Which of these mechanisms are possible and where, and which are desirable are questions to ask. Which of them carry risks to journalism, and what to do to mitigate those risks? That's another question. And these are the burning issues that this segment of the World News Media Congress is going to address. We don't start from zero in this question because a year ago, the leaders of WAN-IFRA and the World Editors Forum and UNESCO agreed on a partnership to try and address this crisis of news media viability. Many activities have flowed from this crisis, one of which is research conducted by what was called the Economist Intelligence Unit and now called Economist Impact. And Antonia Curl led that research, and she's here to tell us a bit about the highlights of that research. And then we'll go into a panel discussion. Antonia is manager in the Policy and Insights team at Economist Impact. She has many years of experience in delivering large-scale research and consulting projects for Fortune 500 companies, for foundations and NGOs. Antonia, take it away, please.
Thank you, Guy. Bear with me while I share my screen. All right, so thank you all very much for having me. I think it's clear that the media industry is under tremendous pressure and facing significant challenges right now, with thousands of media organizations struggling financially at a time when trusted, accurate information is a matter of life and death. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about some of the research that the Economist Impact team has been conducting over the past 6 months with support from UNESCO. They came to us, as I said, about 6 months ago to try and answer this question. really trying to understand what the economic impact of COVID-19 has been on the news media industry at the national, regional, and global level. So we set out to collect as much data as we possibly could to try and answer this question. And the data we collected broadly fell into two categories. One, on the global side, looking at as many countries as we possibly could. Over 50 are included in our data set. And the remaining piece looked at 10 country deep dives, which was really focused on policy or national responses to try and address these challenges around media viability. And those countries were in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So what we found is that COVID-19 was really an accelerator of existing trends that had been happening in the industry for a long time. One example of this is that COVID-19 has accelerated the decline of print sales revenue and circulation by up to 3 years. And newspapers as a percentage of the overall media advertising expenditure have gone from 20% in 2009 to only 6% in 2020. And obviously, because printed newspapers are a main source of information for other types of journalism, a knock-on effect to print will have significant impacts for the rest of the industry. We also found that COVID-19 has accelerated the rise of digital news consumption and delivery, with as much as 10 billion that could be lost from print to internet advertising by 2025. In 2020, we saw that internet advertising took over 50% of the total ad market for the first time. And you can see from this graph here that social media as a percentage of the internet advertising segment went from just 4% in 2009 to 35% in 2020. And this has significant implications with competition for reader attention and advertising dollars, leading to almost a race to the bottom as news media outlets compete, and resulting in an increase in clickbait, journalism, and even mis and disinformation. So what have some countries actually been doing to address some of these challenges? We looked at COVID-19 stimulus packages and the amount of support that was available to news media organizations. And of the 10 countries we looked at, only one, Indonesia, had an explicit mention of news media organizations in their COVID stimulus packages. Some other countries like Nigeria and Senegal do mention creative industries or cultural industry sectors under which news media organizations could fall. But this kind of vague language makes it really difficult to assess the level of support that's available. We also found that 4 countries have implemented some form of direct subsidy to media organizations, but many of these are not without controversy. So the challenge here is transparency around government funding, and it's very difficult to understand how much money is going to news media organizations, how that money is being spent, and even how those news media organizations are being selected in the first place. And this obviously raises concerns about freedom of expression and editorial independence. We also found that many news media organizations have really limited options when it comes to investment and access to capital. So only 4 countries of the 10 that we looked into had at least one news media organization that was listed on the stock exchange. And I think only 2 of those had some form of a credit rating. So this makes it really difficult for news media organizations to access capital, particularly for smaller startup organizations that may be appearing in the wake of the closure of larger incumbents. So what does this all mean? Essentially, the overall health of the news industry has already been in decline, but COVID-19 has accelerated those trends. And this issue around of lack of access to capital and investment makes it really difficult for organizations to try and innovate out of the crisis in this current market. As I said, we found this existing patchwork of policy responses that could extend direct and indirect support, but a lack of transparency, again, is a huge challenge and raises concerns around independence and freedom of expression. So before I hand back over to the panelists, I wanted to sort of have a bit of a shameless plug in that we have a new report that is coming out in January and has been supported by our colleagues at UNESCO that really goes into all of these findings in a lot more detail. There's an opportunity to analyze a global data set of over 50 countries that are looking at this question of media viability, a chance to look at industry trends and forecasts, and also to take a look at some of these initiatives that I've mentioned that could help support the news industry going forward. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Guy. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Antonia. Wow, so I'm sure many in the audience at the World News Media Congress know this experientially, but suddenly it's their hard data, and as you say, there's more to come. So I think we've got some sense of the real structural scale of the crisis and its intensifying range, and also some I suppose, tentative policy solutions. And now we have the most fantastic panel to really discuss these and other issues. And so I'm going to introduce them as I ask them questions. And I'm going to begin with our first panelist, who is Lisa McLeod. Lisa McLeod is Principal Publishing Lead at FT Strategies, of course, FT Financial Times. FT Strategies, she's working there particularly with subscriptions consultancy, has just included a 9-month subscription program with 8 European publishers and a digital revenue project. And Lisa, you also partner with Women in News as a trainer, consultant, and advisor, and you deal with digital transformation in newsrooms across the globe, having personally led 2 digital transformations at Africa's largest media companies. So Lisa, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And here's the first question. In your now vast experience, what are a few of the most impactful digital transformation steps that legacy news media enterprises, big and small, in different parts of the world are undertaking? Those particularly that help to reduce costs or bring in income. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that introduction, Guy. Yes, and I've had a most unique experience, particularly over the last couple of years. I've been sort of bouncing between the UK and South Africa, and in the last couple of years, I've done a lot of work with African newsrooms. One of the things that we focused on very hard for Women in News was thinking about the stability index for African newsrooms particularly. So this is a topic that I am really, really fascinated with. And now that I have joined FT Strategies in the last couple of years, we are in fact at the moment working on a global sustainability index for publishing as well, which is going to be fantastic, I think, and involves, the input from hundreds of publishers from all over the world. And that just brings me, I think, to my first point. And I know I only have a few minutes, but the first point I'd like to make is really that there's a massive gap between the situation in the global north and for publishers elsewhere in the world, particularly in developing nations. The latest World Press Trends report that we spoke about a couple of days ago showed that the revenue projections across the respondents in the developing countries, they're predicting revenues up 21% this year. In the global south, 5% lower in developing countries. So a huge discrepancy between the two. So that's just a very important point, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. In terms of the most impactful digital transformation, this is pretty obvious, but the things that we are seeing all over the world are move to reader revenue. For those companies that are able to, obvious, but it certainly has been a lifesaver for many publishers. An exploration of new models in reader revenue, which I think is a very, very important point to make as well. A lot of publishers moving more towards membership, thinking about donations, and that is a trend that has certainly taken hold in the States among local publishers. A third one is a move to registrations in anticipation of the death of third-party cookies. because many of those publishers that are not able to actually monetize through reader revenue at this stage have been extremely dependent on the advertising revenue still. And that is something that I think publishers are slowly starting to realize is going to become very problematic within the next year or so as the privacy issues increase. And then finally, the saddest of all, really, in terms of digital transformation steps, I think is diverting resources away from newspapers. Many newspapers have had to close during COVID. This is more of a cost-saving aspect, if you like, and cost reduction. But on the cost reduction front, I've seen across the board newspapers reducing their support services, adding automation wherever possible. And we've had a lot of sessions on AI, but it doesn't always mean just in journalism. It sometimes means in back office and actual support services in newsrooms. Reducing the overheads of print wherever possible is certainly a huge cost-saving activity. But the most deleterious of all of these cost-saving activities, which is also very common, is getting rid of really, really qualified editorial staffing, because that is often where a lot of cost lies in publishers. Of course, the knock-on effect of that is that you then in a vicious circle, because you can't really start reader revenue activities when you have actually got rid of a lot of editorial staff. I know that sounds all very negative, but you did ask. Certainly some more positive comments to come a little bit later, but I would say that COVID has been extremely difficult and has had a far greater effect on smaller publishers and a far greater effect on publishers in the global south than in the north for the most part.
So a quick follow-up. I guess for the FT, New York Times and so on, the move to subscriptions is bringing in some revenue, perhaps not enough to compensate for the loss of print advertising, but it's working. And so is the scenario then that we'll have survival of the biggest, but those that are small, especially in economies where people don't have credit cards, is it that we'll see extinction there? And if so, why should those who are succeeding care about the decline of smaller voices, even in a place like the UK, small town media, which cannot make that transition?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I think that I think that there is going to be a massive contraction. I can't see how there won't be, to be honest with you. I mean, there's an excellent report again from the Reuters Institute. This was Rasmus and Richard Fletcher, who wrote about the fact that this is, funding for journalism is not something the public worries about. It's just not something that the public worries about at all. And smaller publishers close and they disappear. I think that the COVID, the successive waves of COVID, absolutely will cause massive contractions in the industry. Do we care about it as an industry? Absolutely, 100%. I mean, even in the States, you can see a lot of consolidation going on. We had a great M&A activity report from Justin Eisenberg the other day. There are fewer and fewer great big companies that are driving the news agenda. And do I think that's healthy? Absolutely not. I mean, I would very much like to see a lot more support for smaller publishers across the board. And I'm just so grateful for those that are managing to survive right now.
Mm-hmm. And I guess it has a press freedom dimension as well.
Of course.
If there's only a few big players who have to face the political flack or hostile attempts at takeover in the form of government capture, it's kind of
absolutely, and that is something that you do see very clearly. I know that's something we'll probably be talking about a bit later, but of course there is always the option for government intervention or support. Again, in many less developed nations, that doesn't look anything like a sort of a good scenario for them. That comes with a lot of control. It comes with a lot of editorial, overbearing editorial influence, and withholding support, should the publishers not be playing the game. So, in many nations, this is actually quite a desperate situation. And I just don't think that we should lose sight of that, particularly when we're speaking from the benefit of nations that have full 5G, a massively competitive news industry, lots of storage on our phones, for example. And when we're talking about the willingness and ability to pay for news in other countries, this is just not a reality So this is something we all need to bear in mind, and as an industry, be very, very cognizant of. Democracy is absolutely threatened in those countries. Yes.
Okay, well, let's see if we have some more positive news from Michal Eerstredner. Michal is our next speaker. She's co-founder and executive director of Sembra Media, and she has helped hundreds of journalistic startups to diversify revenue sources and understand the digital market in Latin America and in other regions. And for example, she's built partnerships and won international funding, connecting independent journalism startups with human rights foundations, tech companies, and investors. So, Michal, let's hear from you, because you're dealing with, I think, a different constituency to that which is probably listening to us here, because we're talking mainly with the legacy media companies. You're dealing with the digital startups. What are they doing to reduce costs, bring in income? Over to you.
So the most successful steps they're taking to accomplish sustainability in this ecosystem is obviously putting the audience at the center. That's kind of obvious at this point, but we should keep reminding the media to keep putting the audience at the center and treating the audience as a community, building a community to lead it to new business models that center their needs of their audience and can fulfill the needs of their audience. Another really important step they are taking is building interdisciplinary teams. In our recently launched Inflection Point International report, we found that digital independent media who hire business and sales staff earn 6 to 9 times more revenue than others. And when they also hire tech and innovation teams, what we frequently call product managers, their income increased 3 times, even when they lack the business team. So this is kind of obvious, but it's not that simple for a startup to think this way. They clearly have learned over the last years, and we've seen that they got more grants that they had in 2016 when we did our last research. And in 2020, 37% of the Latin medium income came from grants. Latin America also has an unprecedented amount of women leaders and independent digital media natives, which also impacts the diversity of the teams and the better coverage of unrepresented communities, which lead us to the first point, which lead us to meeting the needs of their communities. So these strategies lead to the better results in the digital native ecosystems. So when we see huge teams led only by journalists and without a diversified business model, we see that there's a really short livelihood for them in this ecosystem. And these other paths are what we've seen had the best chances to survive this ever-changing digital ecosystem. In Latin America, over the last 6 years, we've removed about 28% of the organizations on our media directory because they cease publishing for more than 6 months. This is an incredibly positive rate, considering all the challenges, the safety challenges, like the economic challenges they face and what they have been through during this ongoing pandemic. But I should mention also that some of the media that are still on our directory might have been supporting their organization with funders' own money or based on volunteer work. So there's a mixed situation there, but there's still a low rate of failure. And it has to do on how they manage their team and how they allocate their resources, and if they build a network of alliances with others instead of competing with each other like we used to do in this industry. So those are the media that are growing, even in this situation.
Mm-hmm. So that's really interesting, because I think the rate of failure in startups in other sectors is often a lot higher than that.
Mm-hmm.
And you said it's 28% in the ones you're working with. So is there one or two cases, or are there one or two cases you could tell us about really great success where an enterprise has really been able to expand its scale of audience, its impact by news coverage, its sustainability over time?
There are great examples. I will be unfair, but I will try to pick two different situations for you to see the how can different strategies can end up in sustainability. First of all, we could look at GK in Ecuador, GK in Spanish. They are it's not a journalistic media in Ecuador, but they cover a lot of different topics. They have newsletter service, they have a membership, they have a really strong content agency, and their content agency have been a massive business for this media. They used to have some publicity, they used to syndicate their content. They have a already diversified business model, but in the last 3 years, they really grew their content agency, and they've been developing different type of products, even in the pandemic, to help different companies that are well aligned with their mission and their values, to communicate with their employees, to communicate the changes in their corporations. They really master this business model. And even though they have a membership, and they launch it with I think a really clever strategy showing how they develop their membership and involving their readers, I do think that, and we've seen this in our region, and Lisa kind of mentioned it before, we've seen that reader revenue depends on many different factors, and you have to have an audience trained or willing to pay. You also have to have an audience that has the ability to pay, and also you need to have a bigger audience or more traffic to kind of have that really good cohort of loyal readers to consider that a main source of income. So having this diversified business model for GK was really intelligent, and even they do this membership as a way to show their most liable readers that they can be a part of their journalism, and also to show more transparency. This is kind of I think this is an interesting example, because it shows the power of the content agencies in Latin America, and we've seen that with other type of startups. And I will shortly, I do a short example. Posta FM in Argentina.
Michal, I think just,
yeah.
Michal, because of time, let me stop you there for a moment. But thank you so much for that. So we've looked at two situations at the enterprise level, the legacy media and startups in the news business. I'm going to switch gear a bit now and speak about the bigger policy environment. And the first person I want to ask there is Camille Ice. Camille works for the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. She's been there since 2017, Chief of Global Partnerships and Policy, previously worked in the Obama administration, Senior Advisor on Anti-Corruption, and has also worked as a Senior Officer at USAID. That's very relevant to her background to what she's going to tell us about. And what I'm going to set the stage to ask her to tell us is, I believe that you and colleagues at the OCCRP are developing a proposition for a mechanism to support investigative journalism where it recovers stolen public funds. Over to you, Camille.
Great. Thanks, Guy, and good to be here with you all. You know, to your point about a proposed mechanism, we hope that this is something that can be taken forward, but really what there is and what this is rooted in is an emerging consensus and recognition about the unique role of investigative journalism and the role that it plays as a public good. There's, you know, as many of you are well aware, investigative journalism has been recognized as a bit of a lost leader for traditional and legacy media in recent years, in that it can be the most expensive to do. It can take the longest to put out a story. It might be what an outlet can be best known for. It can pull in new readers, but it's not guaranteed in the same way. It doesn't have that same daily news hook momentum. But at the same time, investigative journalism plays a unique role, particularly investigative journalism that exposes corruption and wrongdoing, in actually pulling extremely valuable and vast resources back into the public sphere. So at OCCRP, we're a global network of investigative journalists that works cross-border with independent media outlets and journalists around the world. But we track and monitor our own impact, chiefly in terms of advanced accountability. So since 2011, OCCRP's investigations and stories have contributed to the return of more than $7.3 billion in illicitly acquired funds back to the public sphere. So in terms of fines levied, assets seized, et cetera. And that's, you know, just one news outlet there. So what we have been talking with other colleagues, particularly in the nonprofit investigative space, and the mix of public and private donors about is the real need for a mechanism that would do two things. That would vastly increase the amount of resources that are out there, particularly given the disequilibrium of investment on the other side, if you will, in terms of pumping out disinformation and other non-truthful reporting. And number two would be structured in a way that fundamentally allows a wider pool of media outlets doing this work, doing this investigative reporting, to benefit even from just some small percentage of those funds that are ultimately returned. I just want to point out that in terms of increasing the revenue pool, critical to this proposition is tapping into untapped resources to date. There's been work, you know, as recently as we held a convening and pulled some partners and donors together in 2019. When we look at the wider world of development assistance, only 0.4% of that official development assistance is going towards supporting media at all. And it's a much smaller percentage of that then has gone to investigative journalism itself. In terms of both public and private donors supporting independent media, as of 2019, it was less than 500 million. And we know that there are billions of dollars invested by even singular state actors in terms of state affiliated and state representative enterprises that are then exported out into other countries, massively contributing to the disinformation crisis that we have today. So critical to that is looking at some of these untapped resources. It's not clear cut. It'll take a lot of additional work. But corporate fines, you know, coming out of cases like in Danske Bank, for example, corporate fines, court settlements, levying taxes perhaps on tech companies, CSR opportunities, that these are all areas that merit further exploration. Second, and just as important, would be structuring that mechanism in a way that ethically would allow journalism outlets to actually treat these kinds of funds as a viable revenue source. So a pooled mechanism that most importantly would eliminate any sort of bounty hunting optics or actual compromise on editorial independence or conflicts of interest in terms of, you know, ensuring that it wouldn't be the same outlet that perhaps put a lead out there that law enforcement picked up on, or advocates that resulted in one of these official settlements. It wouldn't be, we contributed to this, therefore that money comes back to that same outlet. That would not be the case, but rather so that these different sources of big pots of money that are out there, even just some percentage of them, could be pooled through a mechanism that would then be redistributed to the kinds of outlets out there that are actually contributing and putting these findings out there that allow for this kind of official action to be taken in the first place. Again, a lot of work on that still to be done, but really given the needs that are out there financially, we think it deserves significant additional exploration.
Sure. So I think what's interesting about this initiative is that presumably there'd be some objective formula about what % of recovered funds would go to such a mechanism. So it wouldn't easily be open to instrumentalization to reward some or others for political reasons, because we know that the fight against corruption can often be politically instrumentalized as well. But if you could just briefly say, because I have heard some people in the media community being a bit worried about this, like the bounty hunting thing. I mean, what would your argument be, and what would your call be to publishers and editors and journalists about why this particular mechanism is worth pursuing and even supporting?
Sure. To your point, just initially, to say that, and we don't have time here to get into the specifics of these various revenue sources. Corporate fines, for example, may very well have a lot more potential than, say, the field of asset recovery, which is, a lot more dictated by return of funds to victim countries. There is, a lot of policy and legislation and engagement that, is a longer conversation that definitely needs further hashing out. But in terms of, why this is so critical, there are a few reasons, and I'll give you three. First, I think, is recognition that with all the heightened political pressure on independent media today, particularly on investigative journalism and the kinds of journalists that expose, scandal and sensitive information that the most corrupt around the world don't want coming out, that pressure is increasingly financial. As treacherous as the security, digital and physical terrain is for journalists doing this work, it's really that financial threat that can be existential to this kind of work in the first place, not only because of how political pressure has translated to advertising revenues and the effect there, but also with the serious uptick in use of financial tools like legal threats, vexatious lawsuits, slap suits, that can take the lead journalists of these, investigative outlets and really dedicate their time to just having to figure out the insurance packages and how to deal with these kinds of threats increasingly. So we really need to look at, adding to the pool of resources that are out there. When we look at that disequilibrium in terms of what's being spent on pumping out untruthful news, disinformation, we just need to ramp up and significantly scale the investment in the kind of truthful reporting that outs that dynamic in the first place. Secondly, again, coming back to the way this would be structured, there's a lot of concerns. Again, it's a much longer conversation about the kinds of funding that media outlets can take. There's a lot of concern about conflicts of interest. There's a lot of media outlets that can't take government funding because of a number of the dynamics that have already been proposed and brought up in this conversation. But the mechanism and why we would look at a pooled global trust, right, that where funds could then be invested in a financial mechanism that would help that pot grow. But it would also be to eliminate those conflicts of interest. So you don't have an outlet in one country taking funding from its own government, which presents a complicated situation, or one outlet taking funds from an unsavory corporation that has done bad things, right? But actually taking these kinds of funds that are coming out of a mix of situations from a mix of donors, putting them together and setting up a structure that would ensure the redistribution of these kinds of funds in a fair and justified way to proven organizations and eliminate that the issue that comes from the direct origin or source. And finally, I just add that this kind of funding would be core funding. So much of the funding for the nonprofit world or nonprofit journalism world, investigative journalism world, is in fact project led. And the reality, not to get too far of our conversation here, is that these kinds of outlets do need to be able to invest more in that direct reader engagement. Core funds allow you to manage your finances, to pursue the stories that are primarily in the public interest, without having to say you promised a donor only to look at one issue. So it's fundamentally about setting it up in a way that protects that editorial independence and allows for a real focus on telling the most important stories that are in the greatest public interest.
Okay, thank you, Camille. So as I said, this is looking at more system-wide, not enterprise-wide issues. And I come to our last panelist, and then hopefully we have time to race through quick Q&A with the other panelists who we have heard from. This is Frances Cancross, who's recognized in the UK as Dame Cancross, a famous British economist, journalist, and academic, formerly the rector of Exeter College in Oxford, and in 2019 chaired the UK's independent review into the future of quality news provision, known as the Cancross Review, which was about the sustainability of production and distribution of high quality journalism. So indeed, this is a very interesting case at the system-wide level, because your commission was set up to assess the extent of the problem and where it was the worst, and then to coalesce different ideas into what could be workable solutions in the UK. Could you tell us initially why did the UK government, what led it to set this commission up? Were there lobbies? Was there public outcry, Parliament? Give us the background.
Well, it was, in a sense, a producerist development, because I think that the main driving force came from members of Parliament who were worried by the rapid decline and closure of local newspapers. Local newspapers have always been a vital tool for members of Parliament in scattered constituencies around the country to get their speeches, their great ideas, their achievements in front of the voters. And it was the increasing disappearance and shrinking of local papers, I think, that ultimately spurred the government into action. I think that given that we've been hearing a lot about the disadvantages of what's been happening to news, I'd just like to say a couple of things about the good things that have been happening. For an individual, far more high quality news is now available free than has ever been the case before. And far more international news is now available free or nearly free than has ever been the case before. And that in itself is an enormous benefit to consumers. Economists have this term revealed preference. If you say you like oranges more than apples, but when I offer you both fruits, you pick the apple, this reveals something about what you want. And in the sense that people have switched paper news for online news, it does show that people are enjoying that way of reaching news more than the way that they were offered before. The main thing that we suggested, the most important thing to my mind was...
Can I interrupt you a second just before you come to that? Sorry.
Yeah.
So the UK publishers were not really the driving force in setting up your commission. It was the parliamentarians.
I think that the UK publishers were very pleased to have something set up. I don't think that they had been the leading lobby for it, or the one that the government would have been most inclined to listen to.
Right. So but please tell us then, perhaps, what was the most influential recommendation you came up with, and what was the least influential recommendation?
Well, I think the least influential was the one that I was most hoping would be accepted. The difficulty with this whole problem is how you funnel money, public money, to news groups without being accused of corruption, without appearing to support only those news groups which say nice things about the government in charge. And we saw earlier on in the little video that in many countries, government news was being helped with government money while private news was dying. And that seemed to me to be a disastrous way forward. So what I wanted was what we called a public interest news foundation, some body that would be created as free as possible of government control, and that would decide where, if any, money should go, and that money should go. I mean, the other question in all of this is, why news? After all, department stores are closing left and right, taxi drivers make a terrible fuss here about Uber, and so on and so forth. So what is so special about news you should rescue it? And I could show you plenty of British pages in British papers where you would think there's no way that anyone should go out of their way to rescue this kind of news. But there are kinds of news which were what we call public interest news. And they include reporting on the machinery of government in action, on local councils, on hospitals, or hospital boards, on courts. And all of that really needs to be done by somebody with some professional training and some professional sense of what they're trying to say and what is right and what is wrong in the way they report it. And investigative journalism is another area. We've talked about that today already. It's incredibly expensive. And as somebody said to us in the United States, you drill a lot of dry wells in trying to produce good investigative journalism. So those were the areas that seemed to me should be the focus of any kind of help. But this was an idea that died on the drawing board. Government didn't accept it. However, what has just happened, and I think is rather interesting, is that the Scots, who, as you know, in this country are very keen to distance themselves from the Sassenachs on the wrong side of the border, the Scots have announced, have carried out an inquiry and have come up with very similar conclusions that there should be some kind of public interest foundation for supporting that kind of news. And there should be some change to the law that in the United Kingdom constrains charities from giving money to support news groups. The charities should be given a way in which they can dish out that kind of support. So I think all eyes should be on Scotland over the next year or so to see if they succeed where England has failed.
Yes, I know that in your review you proposed this body as a kind of something analogous to an arts council, which does exist, and in fact in a number of countries and does dispense money. But as you said, that didn't fly with the UK government. But we will watch Scotland carefully to see what comes out of that. Let's just see if we can have a quick round again to ask people, because we're running a bit out of time here. We can extend a little bit. So I'm going to try and ask you yes, no questions, all of you, and then maybe throw in a sentence or two that you weren't able to. So Lisa, here's my first yes, no question to you. Medium and small legacy news organizations, can they innovate their way out of this crisis? Fully, partially, or barely? You can choose one. Can they innovate fully, partially, or barely?
Some fully, others partially, others no.
Okay. Now, my second choice of questions to you is the other kinds of interventions that they would look for other than innovation. Choose from the following. Should they look to funds from Google, directly Google's news initiative? Should they look towards a bargaining code like the Australian model? Or should they look to the reform of ad technology, ad tech? So you have three options there. Funds from Google News Initiative, that's charity, Australian bargaining code, which is a statutory, or change in ad tech.
Yeah, that is a really, really good question. I'd like to say all of the above, but realistically,
you choose one, the most important.
Number one, Google at the moment.
Okay.
That is
okay.
an extremely important source of innovation funding for small publishers at the moment.
Okay, thank you. So now you have your 2 or 3 sentence general statement, and then we have to say
Thank you.
goodbye.
Okay. Yeah. No. Well, let me just speak to that for a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of antipathy in the industry about funding coming from some of the platforms. I can completely understand that. I've been there myself over time. But I'm saying that I can tell you once again, if we bear in mind that many publishers are only around or only able to innovate due to some of this funding, I cannot discount it completely as a really, really important source of survival funding for them and innovation funding from them from that perspective. And it's not coming from anywhere else. And on that basis, I've fully endorse that. And the truth of the matter is, in terms of innovation, as they say, necessity is the mother of invention. I'm continuously surprised by the small publishers and the amazing work that they're doing to survive and to come up with really, really incredible innovations under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. So, hats off to them, and I can only hope that they can keep going for as long as it takes.
Okay. Well, let's move to Michal. Michal, you have to choose again here, please. Which of the following would be most important to startups? Skills and ideas, number 1. Access to capital, like a small business fund, number 2. Or selling fact-checking services to Facebook?
Number 1, I would say, but number 2 is really important. But when you don't have number 2, number 1, it's really important to survive.
Okay, thank you. And your 3-sentence wrap up?
I just wanted to leave the panel with some recommendation for the ecosystem. We really want to, I want to leave the message that we really think that diversifying revenue is key to any media, but mostly for digital media natives is life or death. And we just found out in our new research that there's a balance between 2 to 6 revenue sources that this type of media can handle. If they go over 6, they could overdo it and burn out or get a lack of resources. And if they don't even have a second revenue source, they are really putting in danger their editorial freedom. And we talk about the teams, but I really want to highlight the fact that if we don't train the journalists that are going to be out there and trying to have a career in journalism in the next 5 to 10 years, if they don't know how the media function, if they don't know how a digital media operates, they won't be able to survive or have a career. And we will miss a lot of interesting and important voices in this market. And trying to conversate with Camille's point about really have a fund that can avoid this only looking at the investigative work type of funds, and also using these funds for core operation in this media. If we only look at the money they need for their investigative work, they will get grants that will kill them when they end. And this is a really important notion that we all as media devs need to understand and apply to our work, So I just wanted to strengthen that out, and I'm glad that we have this conversation among women, and these ideas. I think it's really important to have this conversation, and we can no longer avoid this conversation anymore.
Well, thank you. And I'm sure some of those suggestions you made are relevant not just to the native startups, but to the legacy media as well. So let's go to Camille. Camille, very quickly, what's the business model of OCCPR and how replicable is this for other organizations?
Sure. So we're a nonprofit organization. We are nonprofit media, and that means, we take funding from a mix of public and private and individual donors that come in the form primarily of grants, some of which are strictly for reporting and projects, and others which are core flexible grants, increasingly over the last few years as donors have better understood the need for that. We also take public donations and are exploring other revenue sources and dabbling in film optioning for some of our stories and findings. But what's critical to all of this, and when we think about the sustainability, and what I think sometimes is missed in that conversation, is just for nonprofit media and for investigative reporting in the first place, that it's really all about being able to deliver on your mission. You can't secure what is in fact your greatest source of revenue, which are these grants that hinge on mission fulfillment and delivering impact. If donors love to sort of allocate funds, sometimes in core grants, to exploring these new revenue models. And overwhelmingly, our findings have been that yes, we could do some of these new things, but often they can detract from our actual fundamental mission, which is holding power to account and using our cross-border network to deliver the stories that allow the wider world and the wider ecosystem to act on these findings and deliver accountability, justice, et cetera. The other critical part of our model, and when we think about replicability, is also just the huge focus on collaborative journalism and the cross-border model that we have. Fundamentally, OCCRP, we are infrastructure for this wider set, over 50 independent media outlets around the world. And fundamentally, the way that we are structured, it helps make this investigative journalism better, stronger. It raises the standards faster by having trusted partners and the technological tools to access the data, and frankly, cheaper, because these are shared resources and they are open source tools. OCCRP Aleph is our investigative data platform that possesses and allows journalists across networks to access and cross-reference data that allows them to expose the corruption in the first place. It is open source, and a number of major media across Europe in particular have adapted their own instances of OCCRP Aleph. We encourage that going forward, but it's about staying true to the mission and that return on investment in the first place.
Thank you so much. So that's really interesting also, particularly because you can save other media outlets, as you said, on the costs of doing.
And if okay, I would just add that investment in the public engagement that was brought up earlier is just so crucial, because that's the way you can stay true to your mission, but actually pull in more directly from your readers, which does have, we believe, a lot of promise and has started to add to ours as well.
Super. Well, let's come to our last speaker. And so, Dame Francis, from your experience with your inquiry, what would you advise people in other countries who want to have an inquiry that will make a difference?
I think I probably would tell them not to have an inquiry, but just to go away and read what already exists. There's been plenty of mulling over what to do, none of it producing results that has made a huge difference to the general decline in newsrooms and the finances of newspapers. we've just lived through the most dramatic revolution in technology that I think the world has ever seen, compressed into 20 years. And it came on the heels of a tremendous advertising boom and a period when, in many countries, newsrooms have been rather well financed. Not everywhere, but there was the last part of the last century had been fairly comfortable for the news business. It's very unusual with a technological revolution for the old technology to survive unchanged into the future beyond that, what happens. And what we're groping our way towards is how we continue, and we will continue, to provide people with the news that they want. One of the obvious things that has to happen is that individuals have to learn to pay for news. They've always done so when they bought their morning paper. They now need to do so when they see it online. And it may be that it may take time, but advertising is not going to come back as the subsidy that covered half the cost of a typical newsroom. That's gone because Google provides superior technology. Amazon provides a superior technology. It's gone. So either newsrooms have to be smaller, cheaper, quicker, or we have to find ways of putting outside money in. And the main way to put outside money in is to get the individuals who read the news to pay for it. That's better than governments paying, and it's probably better than charities paying. It's the readers who really need to come back and support what we all have to say.
But could I just, in the very short time we've got, was there not value in raising this issue on the public agenda by having your commission, and secondly, by having a central focal point where different ideas came together, even if some didn't lead to anything, but it created a sense of national purpose, and it wasn't just casual research by fragmented stakeholders. Sure.
No, I mean, I think, when I rather flippantly said that they shouldn't do it, I mean, a lot of the arguments that we digested and put forward in the review are ones that would apply in other countries. So, it should be rather easier in other countries to produce such a document. I think the main thing countries need to realize is the importance of having professional teams of people. This is something individuals have to realize, not just governments. Professional and trained teams of people following and reporting on what government in all its various guises does in running a country. That's ultimately why we need professional journalists, and it's ultimately why the public as a whole benefits from having professional journalism. It's when you see, as we saw right at the beginning, good journalists getting locked up, that that's a country which doesn't have a really working, beneficial way of governing itself. And the support that people are ultimately willing to give to the continued professional journalism is a measure of how much they value democracy and freedom of speech.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We're going to wrap up now. I think that was an important point to end on. There is a new session beginning at 1600 on news automation. So please do come to that. Let me just conclude by trying to make an impassioned plea to the listeners. What we've heard here are some of the issues about the problem, which you know all too well, and some of the solutions and potential solutions. So we looked at, with Antonia, government aid in response to COVID. With Lisa, we looked at digital transformation of legacy media. We looked at digital startups with Michal. We looked at potential mechanisms to reimburse news media for recovering public monies. That was with Camille. And then we discussed this issue of a national coming together to research the particularities of the problem in a country concerned and outline solutions that may fly in the national context. no guarantee about that, as we have been reminded. You also, in this, you received a taste of the Economist impact research, and indeed you are invited to join the full launch early next year, which we'll do again, UNESCO, Economist, and WAN-IFRA World Editors Forum. The Feast of Ideas that you've heard has also been, it'll be reflected in other upcoming UNESCO outputs for release early next year. One of them to mention is a handbook of good practices in income generation by news media around the world, compiled by somebody you, the audience, will know well, Larry Kilman, former executive director of WAN-IFRA. And another output will be short, 16 pages policy brief to sensitize governments and others about this escalating crisis and the need for urgent responses. So I invite you all to make potential use of these UNESCO branded outputs in your internal and your external work to address this immense challenge. And you, the leaders of the news media, who know so well at close hand about the stress and often the carnage in the news industry, you have a huge role to play. I know that sounds corny, but in fact, I think as Lisa perhaps mentioned, far too few people outside the industry know about what's going on in the industry. And so we have to send out this SOS. We have to convince them, readers, stakeholders, the advertising industry, regulators, parliamentarians, and so on. We have to send out the SOS to convince them that the world's information system is now at stake and it's crying out to be addressed. And so we have to come together, share the experience, ramp up the volume, and intensify these efforts to save journalism before it is too late. On that note, I hope that my impassioned appeal got you fired up to really not just try and deal with this on an individual basis, but to raise the volume and alert your audience and alert those you deal with, the advertising, marketing industry, the internet companies and parliamentarians and government. So I thank the panelists. This was a really, really interesting and I think constructive discussion. I think we raised a lot of very interesting and challenging ideas. And so we'll be back. We'll continue this work when WAN-IFRA World Editors Forum at UNESCO. So watch the space and please be in touch with all of us. I think you can certainly find all the speakers here very easily on the internet. And enjoy the next session. And thank you for being with us for now.
Thank you, Guy. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.